Welcome to the Education of a Financial Planner, where we look at the major concepts in financial planning through the lens of two quant investors who are learning the ropes of the planning process and how to help clients achieve their long-term goals. Learn along with us as experienced financial planner Matt Ziegler helps us understand the most important financial planning concepts that impact all of us and how we can apply them to achieve the best outcomes in our financial lives. In each episode, we will work through one major financial planning concept from the ground up and learn how we can apply it in the real world. From retirement to college savings to taxes to estate planning, we will cover a wide range of topics that apply to each of our everyday lives. We hope you will join us in our learning journey.
Justin Carboneau and Jack Forehand are principals at Validity Capital Management. Matt Ziegler is managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Validity Capital or Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Validity Capital or Sunpoint Investments.
All right, guys, today we're going to talk about Monte Carlo simulations in financial planning, from what it is to why it's used to how investors can look at models like this to determine if they're on track for or in their savings and eventually for when they enter retirement. Many financial planning tools actually have Monte Carlo embedded in them. And so we thought it would be good to do an episode on this topic. Hopefully we can spice things up a little bit and it's not too dry. But for those investors who want to learn more about how you can think about Monte Carlo simulations, try to stay with us through this whole episode as we get into it. Matt, let's just kind of at a high level, what is a Monte Carlo simulation?
The most fun question ever. All right, so before we're going to talk about the textbook definition in a second. But the first thing I have to say is when I think of Monte Carlo simulation, I think of the three Montes. And so the three Montes in my heart are Monte Carlo, which is referring to this famous casino. And when we say Monte Carlo, when we think casino, we're thinking fabulously amazing outcomes, disastrously bad outcomes, and typical mediocre outcomes that you might have when you go visit a casino. So Monte 1 is Monte Carlo, the casino. Monte 2 is Monte Python. And that's the reminder, and part of why these things are so useful, that sometimes weird stuff happens. Sometimes you get a dead parent. Sometimes the manly lumberjack is in drag. You need the reminder that there's weird scenarios embedded in whatever you're imagining. And then it's actually a tie for the third Monte, and the tie is between the full Monte and Montel Jordan. Jeez, don't get the wrong Montes in there. So we think of the full Monte because when something goes wrong, as is in the musical and the fantastic movie, the steelworker loses his job. Well, now what? You got to find a way to make lemonade out of the lemons. And likewise, with the Montel Jordan scenario, this is how we do it because, you got to know how to have fun when stuff goes right. Because if I'm kind of buzzed and it's all because this is how we do it. So the three Montes, before we even get into it, just acknowledge you got the casino, Monte Carlo, you got Monte Python, you got weird scenarios. They're just going to happen. And you got the mix between Montel Jordan and the full Monte. Something's going to happen that you don't expect. You got to have a plan to handle it. All right, you ready for the textbook definition, guys? I'm going to read this, which is way less exciting than my three Montes. So the CFP material tells us that Monte Carlo is a model to predict the probability of a variety of outcomes when the potential for random variables is present. Let's break that down. Monte Carlo, again, that's our casino, good, bad, mediocre realities. It's a model. The map is not the terrain. So is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? It's some mix. To predict the probability of a variety of outcomes, and we're going to talk a lot about this, predicting the probability of a variety of outcomes is about risk. And risks are our definite maybes, things we have odds for, and that's things like market returns or inflation or whatever else. And then when the potential for a random variable is present, which is uncertainty, and that's kind of the stuff we can't know, like how long we're going to live. So my proposed alternate definition to Monte Carlo that I wrote down in my note here is life is random, death is not, and some stuff will probably happen along the way, but we don't exactly know when, so let's do math about it. How's that?
So is it like, this is how we do it?
Justin's singing now. This podcast is going to go downhill very quickly.
This is exactly the way any Monte Carlo conversation deserves to go.
Nice. How do you use it in, I mean, financial planning? Is it just for retirement, or can you use it for other things as well?
So you can use it in retirement. You can use it for making asset allocation decisions with investments. We'll probably touch on a bunch of these. It's a super useful tool. And I say the three Montes in like a tongue-in-cheek way, but I also kind of mean it, because when we do this, there's a lot of stuff we do in the box or in the computer for doing this math, because statistical analysis is not something you're probably going to do off the top of your head. But understanding those concepts is actually really useful, because if I'm thinking about retirement income planning, I want to get the Monty Python scenario in there and find out what's weird and what might happen. If I'm doing it for portfolio analysis, I might want to know in different types of market environments, what kind of things might I expect, because that's what planning is all about, considering a wide range of things and what might unfold.
Before I get into my questions, I was going to go back to this three Monty thing, because before we were talking before we got on, and I was like, there's no way Matt is going to come up with a cool thing about Monte Carlo simulation. And somehow you've done it. I mean, what was it last time? You related Bill Bengen to like Nas and Pulp Fiction or something in the 4% rule?
This is what you're here for. This is the stuff you just can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to make this my mission in life now. I'm going to come up with the most wonky, ridiculous topics now, and I'm just going to see if you can come up with some sort of crazy story around it that like makes it interesting. So you could expect some topics that are going to surprise you in the future here.
I can't wait.
Going back to Monte Carlo, though, I want to ask you about the variables, because, we talked about changing variables, and it seems like there's a lot of variables you could change in a Monte Carlo simulation, like using retirement as an example. I mean, obviously people talk about returns as one example. You can reorder the returns in history, and you can look at different return scenarios, but it seems like there's a lot of other things. You can look at inflation. We talked in our asset location episode about like looking at different asset locations. You can look at cash flows in and out. Like how much do you typically change? How many variables change in one of these typically?
So what's really important is you can change all the variables effectively. Now, different software is going to allow you to change more than others, like a basic retirement planning tool that's for free on the internet might let you just change some basic stuff, but more advanced, like our planning software, we can do all sorts of stuff. And most planners will have some software that deals with, first and foremost, what we call capital market assumptions. And the key here is capital market assumptions are things like historical stock and bond returns, and maybe alts and maybe cash and whatever else you plug in there. And then the correlations between them all. And so you can add in inflation, you can add things in that help you put your thumb on the scale, but your starting point is always your capital market assumptions, usually based on some historical reality. Now from there is the thumb on the scale approach. And I say this because this is the variables, like what do you want to change? So you might want to say, like it's very common to take your long-term stock and whatever returns, asset class returns, and put your thumb on the scale and say, well, let's just dampen them. If our long-term expected portfolio that we're drawing money off on to get through retirement earned 8% of the year historically, what happens if we only get 6% a year, or 4% a year, or 2%? So you can put your thumb on your scale and just in terms of expectations over time. You can also take stuff, and this is really common when we're building investment models, we do something called regime analysis. So now instead of looking at like all of history, what happens if we just run this through a bunch of made up versions of the 1970s when inflation was high, to your point. And so historical versus regime, static versus dynamic, these are all ways you can play with the variables inside of the analysis and still get useful output, still get that dead parrot sketch and see like, well, what would we do if this was how this weird reality played out?
We're going to talk about the probability of success in a second, but first of all, I want to talk about the definition of success. So it seems like with a lot of these Monte Carlo simulations, I either have a success or have a failure. And, in retirement, basically, if at any point along the way I run out of money and I'm broke, that's a failure. It seems like, what is success, though? It seems like, if at the end of the day it's me and $1 in my coffin, like that's technically a success because I didn't run out of money. I mean, is that the way we look at it?
So that's the way like your gut probably wants to look at it. And it's this idea that Monte Carlo is us asking or pointing out that more things can happen than will happen. So we don't know which path you're on. If I boil a pot of spaghetti and I take the first noodle out and I throw it on the wall, Monte Carlo is basically I boil the pot and I just start throwing all the noodles on the wall. And now the scenario is we've got this mess of spaghetti on the wall, and we're picking out any one noodle to say like, okay, what happens if this is the path I'm on? So when we talk about terms of success, you can define success. Actually, let me say risk and uncertainty again first. Risk are the odds, the things we know. Uncertainty are the things that we can't know. So risk might be, these are my expected returns or withdrawal rates. Uncertainty is I don't know when I'm going to die, or I don't know when I might exactly run out of money, things like that. So you might say, I just want to have $1 left when I die. And we can say, what's the highest confidence we have? The right amount of those spaghetti noodles on the wall that are above the $1 when you think you'll die. And you pick a random age, and that's what we go with. We might say too, and it's very common, people will say, it's a failure unless I have $1 million when I retire, because I want to give my charitable foundation a kick, or this is the amount of money I want to leave my kids to take care of the vacation home. Failure is a movable target, and depending how you're going to process the analysis with the risk and uncertainty involved, this is the point. Like, stress test the stuff, raise the red flags, find the Monty Python scenarios, and then understand what happens when stuff goes good or when stuff goes squirrely and get laid off from the steel factory.
Yeah, it's funny. Justin and I were just talking to Jason Buck earlier this week because he's coming on the Show Us Your Portfolio series we have, and he had that book, Die with Zero. And, this is not exactly the point of the book, but like dying with zero is actually very, very difficult to do because there's so many paths you can have. Like, you can't just plan it. So like by the time I'm dead, I've run out of money. Like, there's a lot of scenarios where you try to do that and you run out of money way earlier. So it's actually a very difficult concept to execute, even if you wanted to.
Totally. And again, it's the uncertainty. I can give you risk all day long. We can talk about regime analysis of what stocks did. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. So we think this is starting valuations are high, inflation is here, and we can do all this fun, fancy stuff. But like, you still don't know when you're going to die. You still don't know, like, oh, I had some bigger bill or I had a windfall. This is life. This is why we work with people to help us figure out these things, to survive whatever life throws at us.
We're going to talk about whether this is right a little bit later in the episode. But first I want to ask, like, when we talk about probability of success, like, what do planners typically use? Like, I see out there like 90% a lot of the times when they're running these Monte Carlos. I mean, is that sort of the industry standard for this?
So two things. First, on just confidence intervals, remember statistics, and we're just going to say this high level, get into this if you need to get into it. The engineers always want to know this stuff, and God bless them, the engineers and actuaries, for keeping us on their toes and giving me cold sweats when I think about the questions they're going to ask. So the confidence intervals, when we say like 90% chance of success or whatever, it's here's of all the spaghetti noodles on the wall, there's a cluster. And it's usually a bell-shaped curve or a Gaussian distribution or whatever. And so 68% of the time is the cluster, and 95% is the 2 standard deviation, and 97 point whatever percent is the 3 standard deviations. And it's just how we understand like the data set. So when somebody says 90% chance of success, they're basically saying 90% of the spaghetti noodles are in this area and the other 10% are outside of this area. And then you want to know how far outside of the cluster are those noodles. Did one get stuck to the ceiling fan and the other stuck to the floor, or are they all in the same area of the wall? So that's piece number one. Now the other piece, when we talk about confidence intervals and how financial planners might present them, I think what you really have to ask is the not just confidence and success, but what does the failure mean? So I always like to think about this in terms of the weather. So we've got an inherent bias when it comes to weather, as an example. And so if somebody says, I was looking this weekend, I think it's in Pennsylvania, it's going to be like almost 80 degrees, and you've got a 60% chance of rain. And so a 60% chance of rain also means a 40% chance of sun. Now, the bias we have when we read the weather is if you tell me 60% chance of rain, but then I'm outside and it's sunny, I'm happy. If you told me it was like an 80% chance of sun, meaning a 20% chance of rain, and that's why they usually give you the percent chance of rain on the weather, it's this bias at play. Well then, like if you tell me it probably won't rain, but then it rains, I might get annoyed or upset. And so when we're framing like the success rates of these things, we're trying to have a conversation about like, if the bad thing happens, how bad is the bad thing happen? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I would think if you take this to retirement, I would think telling people there's a probability of a bad thing happening, and the bad thing is like they're broke. That typically is probably much worse than rain, I would think.
Totally, totally. But it's also the reality, back to your point about like dying with zero or like making it sustainable. You're going to have this question of like, it's the scenario where there's a 20% chance of rain and you go to the grocery store and you're like, whew, it didn't rain yet. And you go inside and you get all of your stuff and you've got the biggest load ever coming out to load into your car, and you walk outside and it's still sunny, but everything's wet. And you're like, oh my God, did I just totally dodge the bullet and it rained for the half an hour I was in the store? And you feel lucky. And it's this idea that like, even that percent chance of failure, like it might happen when you're inside. The terrible market event that almost like brings down the financial system, like might happen in the same year that you're extra flush with cash and you didn't have to touch any of your long-term investments. So that probability of rain or probability of failure can be totally skewed by whatever's going on in your life when that negative outcome happens. And it could break you, or it could be a shoulder shrug emoji.
How do you determine the market returns in one of these? I mean, I think at a simple level, you would think about, I could just take every historical annual market return. I could just put them in all kinds of different orders and I could see how it plays out. But I think sometimes they use more advanced statistical techniques than that. So how does that process work?
A very high level. And this is where you just want to know if it's like static or dynamic, or if there's anything influencing that. And sometimes you want to influence it on purpose. So capital market assumptions, we could be looking at the last 100 years of data and correlations and everything between asset classes, et cetera. You can do, like I said, put your thumb on the scale and handicap those numbers and discount them lower, or deliberately change some of the stuff, so at some point we have like a dynamic capital market assumption process where we take the historical numbers but then we adjust for like starting valuations and things like that, where we might say, okay, PEs are really high right now and bond yields are really low and inflation is really a little bit quirky. So that's going to temper our results for the next few years out. And I'm in the camp personally that like it's good to make some of those shorter term adjustments, not to like day trade on, but to say over the next 5 or 10 years, this is more of a historical from this starting point view. You don't have to do that. I think that that's useful. And funny enough, Bill Bengen just showed up on the Money with Katie show the last week or so. And he actually was talking about how he actually does that too. And I was like, all right, I stand with Bengen on this one.
Yeah, well, I remember I was reading in prep for this. Like Bengen did a study basically that if valuations are high and inflation is high, like your safe withdrawal rate is lower.
Totally.
So like there's a lot of research he has to back up what you're doing, like putting some of these assumptions in here because there is evidence.
And remember, like with him in the 4% rule, he wasn't doing like a Monte Carlo analysis. Now, other people have taken his stuff and done the Monte Carlo approach, but he was actually looking at like historical realized sequence return streams. Monte Carlo basically takes those historically realized things and shuffles them, which back to like, we do this so we get the Monty Python scenarios. We want the stuff that's like weird to get shaken out and be like, oh yeah, what happens if you had sky high inflation, disastrous market returns, and whatever else? Because now maybe my spending rate is going up way up in retirement because of inflation, because eggs cost more. But at the same time, all my market returns suck. How long do I survive this scenario?
Picking up on this idea of looking at disaster scenarios, I was playing with Portfolio Visualizer's Monte Carlo tool, which I didn't even know existed before this. And like one of the things they had in there, and I couldn't figure out whether I like it or I don't like it, is they had like something in there where you could force the terrible years first. So you could say basically make the first year always 2008 and then do the Monte Carlo beyond that, or make the first 2 years terrible and then do the Monte Carlo beyond that. So like to some extent that's like a good disaster planning thing, but to the other extent, you're probably skewing it way more towards the negative. So I'm wondering what you just think about that.
So I think, this goes to, and did we talk about the RISA framework on one of the others? I think we did, like the RISA.
I think we did, yeah.
Okay, we should link to that in the notes or whatever for this. I think that is a great idea for people who think that way. And I'm not like condemning or praising, like catastrophizing, but I think some people actually really benefit from that type of analysis because it helps confirm some of their stuff. And the example I would give here is back to like risk and uncertainty. People have different stomachs, tolerances, whatever you want to call it, for stuff happening. And like there's like the brazen reality or some cases maybe brazen neglect. It's like if you have a convertible and there's a 10% chance of rain and you're going into said grocery store, are you comfortable leaving the convertible top down or not? And some people aren't going to think twice about it and be like, whatever. And maybe they're a little annoyed, but they're fine because they have so much money that they don't care. The leather interior got ruined, or they're like, it's a convertible. It's going to happen. Other people are going to be like obsessive about it and like seal the thing up and whatever every single time. So your personality type, I think, lends hugely to the professional you work with understanding that. And then if the only way I'm going to make you comfortable is to see like a doomsday scenario, well, I want to show you a doomsday scenario to get on to the good stuff. Because if we're going to go Montel Jordan when things work out, like, let's go Montel Jordan.
Yeah, I used to have a convertible and I did that once, and like you don't do that twice. Once you leave it out with like the 5% chance of rain and it gets like soaked, you pretty much stop doing that for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and nobody wants to retire in a financial crisis twice, right?
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask you about this Michael Kitz's article. I was doing my CFPCE the other day, and this is one of the articles I had to take a test on. And so before we talked about kind of this 90% chance of success, 10% chance of failure, but that the failure is obviously you're out of money, so that's a big deal. But like he actually wrote an article, or he didn't write it, but someone on his site wrote the article talking about how a 50% chance of success can actually be workable. And I think it sort of revolves around the idea that these are not static things. Like we can change things in your retirement plan. So maybe a 50% chance of success is okay. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that idea.
And this totally goes to like the full Monty scenario, especially. So Bill Bengen talks about this too. So like one of the key things in the 4% strategy is you're actually saying, I'm going to index my spending for inflation over the periods of time that he looked at. And that's a very common thing is we say your fixed expenses versus your variable expenses, and we gross those up in like the retirement planning process. And the reality is, depending on your mix of fixed and variable expenses, depending on things that you can cut or you wouldn't cut, or I go on vacation a lot at the beginning of retirement and then that tapers as I get older towards the end of retirement, like you could have a 50% projected probability of success and then have a bunch of other variables that change for the better, for the worse, or for not at all. So this idea that more things can happen than will happen means you're going to be adjusting for stuff as they come. And the most critical part is, per the Kitsis article, is like understanding where you can temper those things along the line. So if I work at the steel factory and I get laid off, can I still figure out a way to make income and have a little fun, even though my lifestyle is way different than it was, when I was just working and on my track to retirement that got disrupted.
One of the things that I've found with this is, you can like play with Social Security timing and stuff like that, which can have a big, difference for some people in retirement for sure.
I mean, just keep singing this song. You're kind of buzzed, and it's just because I'm going to retire at my full retirement age and get the maximum benefit.
How do you think about taxes with this? So it seems like each client you talk to, like some of them might have a lot of money in a Roth IRA, some might have in a taxable account, some might have it in like a traditional IRA, and that will sort of affect this whole scenario. How do you think about taxes when you look at something like this?
So I actually think on the spending strategy, Monte Carlo can be as useful as it is on like the portfolio and the asset allocation strategy and everything else. And a large part is because of taxes and tax rates. And so a common thing is, we talked about this on the asset location episode. You have your asset allocation, stocks, bonds, cash, alts, whatever, and then your asset location, money in retirement accounts, money in various other things, equity in your house, Roths, stuff like that. So understanding in your capital market assumptions where you're going to adjust for tax rates and then how you're going to potentially take withdrawals from different vehicles at different points of time can make a huge difference in how you respond to a negative event, especially in a moment. So the tax rates and the sequence of returns and the sequence of withdrawals are one of the really useful things that Monte Carlo analysis can help you look at.
I think we're going to basically just become a Michael Kitz's podcast here, because we pretty much are looking. He has so much good stuff on his website that there's always an article about, no matter what topic we're going to talk about, there's always an article. But one of the things I read, and like, I would think framing is really important here. And one of the articles he had on his site is this idea of, well, if you talk about probability of failure with people, that's kind of bad. Like people don't like probability of failure, but then he sort of talked about framing it as like probability of adjustment, or whoever wrote the article. It probably wasn't Kitzis, but that to me seems like an interesting reframing. So how important is it to like frame this in the right way with clients?
The Rory Sutherland thing that I say all the time, which is a flower is just a weed with a marketing budget. it holds true here and everywhere. So I think your probability of adjustment is a great way to look at it, and also a very humbling thing to admit that you are likely going to adjust. More things can happen than will happen. So we can't bet on you necessarily getting some crippling disease or winning the lottery, but we can have a conversation about what do we do if either of those things happen. And what's interesting is those are going to change all the expectations from that point going forward. So as planners, it's really important. And I think you're saying this and I'm actually realizing it. Like, I shy away from the probability of success. I don't mind showing the analysis or talking about the analysis framed that way. But I always personally emphasize back to the 3 Montes. Like, this is not a crystal ball. Kitces has some great stuff on the website too about like how often is Monte Carlo right, which was always one of my questions. Great, we predicted this. Let's go pull that report from 20 years ago and see if you're a millionaire or multimillionaire yet, or whatever the output said. More stuff can happen than will happen. So all that matters here is that we're avoiding the bad scenarios, knowing how to take advantage of the good scenarios, and that we're going to roll with the punches along the way, be them in our personal lives or in markets and our investments.
Yeah, I would think, like, if you're presenting this to a client, saying there's a 10% chance you're going to run out of money is a lot worse than saying there's a 10% chance we might have to adjust your plan. It seems like that is a pretty good way to reframe it and make people like look at it in a different way.
Absolutely. And funny enough, like, the bigger the asset base and the more complicated the asset situation, sometimes the more interesting this gets, because this gets into stuff where somebody might be supporting multiple family members, or they have multiple pieces of property that they don't intend to like pass on to their kids. Been through some very real situations of this where it's not just the sequence of your stock and bond and whatever market returns. It's what do we do when we have 6 pieces of property, one for the parents, one for like the sibling who needs some financial help and whatever else, and then your own life and all their lives are all changing, and then mom and dad die, and when do we liquidate this house, and what's the tax consequences of that? And like, this is just the reality. Adjustments are going to happen, accept that that's the reality, and control for whatever ones you want to avoid with an understanding what are my fixed, variable, and other costs for when stuff happens, what's the most comfortable way for me to deal with the problem.
So let me try to summarize this here. We talked about what a Monte Carlo simulation is, which, just to recap, it's looking at someone's income, expenses, and their investment portfolio and running thousands of simulations to try to determine whether or not someone will, have enough money or potentially run out of money in retirement. And it typically gives you that in these confidence intervals that Matt talked about. There's a bunch of different variables that can be dialed up or down, including, as Matt mentioned, the capital market or asset class return expectations. We talked about how to view, I guess, success or failure of using these Monte Carlo simulations, and that can be viewed differently by different people. And then, I think that framing sort of discussion was interesting. That's an interesting thing to think about, and sort of how you frame it up to help people kind of get the most out of using this tool. And, this is mostly used, hopefully we did a good job with this topic. I mean, this is, like we mentioned, is usually embedded in these financial planning software packages. And it can be quite complex, actually. I've done a few of them where you have a lot of different moving pieces, and those assumptions and pieces can change if things are kind of coming in and out of someone's investment portfolio or other things. So anyways, hopefully you guys found this discussion interesting and useful, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Hi guys, this is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant. You can follow me on Twitter at JJCarbonneau, and follow Matt on Twitter at @CultishCreative. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. Also, if you have any ideas for topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please email us at excessreturnspod@gmail.com. We would like this to be a listener-driven podcast and would appreciate any suggestions. Thank you.